We're surrounded by safety rules every single day, but we hardly ever stop to think about where they actually come from. Well, today, we're going to dive into the really dark origins of our most important nuclear safety protocols. Rules that weren't written in ink, but were forged in absolute tragedy. And I'm not talking about some abstract guidelines cooked up in a committee. No, these are lessons learned in the hardest way imaginable. They were paid for with human lives. Every single rule is basically a ghost story with a moral. And at the heart of so many of these stories, you find this one terrifying image: a brilliant, deadly blue flash. It's the signature of what's called a criticality accident, a burst of ionized radiation that's as beautiful as it is fatal. It's a recurring omen in the stories we're about to tell, a final warning that sadly was almost never seen in time. So, where do we start? Let's go all the way back to the dawn of the atomic age, at the Los Alamos Laboratory. This was a time when the line between groundbreaking science and just unimaginable risk was incredibly blurry. And this is the story of one particular plutonium sphere that earned itself a terrifying name: the Demon Core. Think about that. One single piece of plutonium, and it killed two brilliant physicists in less than a year. First, Harry Daghlian, and then, just 9 months later, Louis Slotin. Two men, gone, killed by the exact same object. So how does that even happen? Well, the answer is terrifyingly simple. On August 21st, 1945, Harry Daghlian was working late, and he was working alone stacking these heavy, neutron-reflecting bricks around the core. And then his hand slipped. He dropped one right onto the core. Blue flash. Then, just 9 months later, Louis Slotin is doing a similar demonstration, but he's using just a simple flathead screwdriver to keep two halves of reflector sphere separated. The screwdriver slipped. In both cases, just a single split-second mistake led to a fatal blast of radiation. You know what they called Slotin's experiment? Tickling the dragon's tail. I mean, come on. They knew exactly how dangerous this was. They were literally poking a sleeping monster with a stick. And, well, eventually that monster woke up. Well, after two brilliant physicists died in almost the exact same way, Los Alamos had to change. They had no choice. Their sacrifice led directly to some of our most basic safety rules. Because Daghlian was working alone, the two-person rule was created. Because Slotin died using his own hands, all future criticality experiments had to be done by remote control. The era of hands-on nuclear physics was over forever. Okay, so rules get made. But what happens when those rules are already there and people just ignore them? Or what if the equipment itself is the problem? Let's look at two stories that show exactly that. Fast forward to 1999, at a fuel processing plant in Japan. A guy named Hisashi Ochi and his team were trying to meet a deadline. And to cut corners, they did something unbelievable. Instead of using the proper, safe equipment, they decided to mix a huge amount of uranium, 7 times the legal limit, in an open stainless steel bucket. As they poured, the solution erupted in that same awful blue flash. And in that instant, that fraction of a second, Hisashi Ochi, who was standing right over the bucket, absorbed an insane amount of radiation, an estimated 17 sieverts. It was the highest dose a human being had ever been exposed to. Just to give you some perspective on how horrifying that number is, a dose of about 5 sieverts is considered lethal. Ochi got more than 3 times that amount. His body's instruction manual, his DNA, was just obliterated. He was kept alive for 83 agonizing days, but his fate was sealed in that first second. The consequences of this were massive, and they were swift. The plant was shut down for good. Company officials actually faced criminal charges, and Japan completely rewrote its nuclear safety laws, forcing truly independent oversight for all of its facilities. That one act of cutting corners changed an entire country's approach to nuclear safety. But see, it's not always about a person breaking the rules. Sometimes the rules are followed perfectly, and disaster still strikes. Back in 1958, a chemical operator named Cecil Kelly was doing his job. He followed every procedure, but the mixing tank he was using had a deadly design flaw. Plutonium solution had settled at the bottom, out of sight. When Kelly turned on the stirrer, it brought it all together into a critical mass. He saw the blue flash. He knew exactly what it meant. He was dead in hours. His death led to rules about fail-safe engineering, designing systems so that an accident is impossible, even if a human makes a mistake.
All right, let's leave the labs behind and head out to sea, right into the thick of the Cold War. We're talking about the Soviet submarine K-19, a boat so plagued with accidents and death that its own crew had a nickname for it, Hiroshima. So it's July 4th, 1961. The K-19 is lurking near an American NATO base, and then the absolute worst-case scenario happens. A tiny pipe in the reactor's primary cooling system cracks, and because the submarine had been rushed into service, there was no backup system. None. The reactor temperature was skyrocketing, and the crew faced a choice: let the reactor melt down, which would almost certainly be seen as a nuclear attack and start World War III, or try something impossible. The captain gets on the intercom and basically asks for volunteers to go on a suicide mission, to go into the reactor compartment, a chamber flooded with deadly radiation, and try to build a new coolant line from scratch. And you know what? 22 men stepped forward. And believe it or not, they did it. They jury-rigged a fix and they saved the sub. They probably prevented World War III. But the cost, my God. 8 of the volunteers died within days. The rest within 2 years. Their bodies were so radioactive they had to be buried in lead-lined coffins. Decades later, for that sacrifice, the entire crew was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. So far, we've been talking about these big, contained incidents, labs, military submarines. But what happens when this stuff gets out into the public, when it's sold as a product, or even used as a weapon? Let's look at 2 totally different stories that show this perfectly. On one hand, you've got Evan Byers, this wealthy American industrialist who thought he was drinking a miracle health drink. And on the other, you have Alexander Litvinenko, a former Russian spy, who was deliberately murdered with radioactive poison. 2 very different substances, 2 very different situations, but both had these huge world-changing consequences. So Evan Byers, he loved this stuff called Radithor. It was basically just water with radium dissolved in it, and they sold it as a cure for everything. He was a huge believer. He drank something like 1,400 bottles of it. The result was, well, a Wall Street Journal headline from the time really says it all. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. That single horrifying death is why the FDA in the United States got the power to actually regulate medical products and demand proof that they're safe. Then, decades later, you have the Litvinenko case. He is assassinated in London with polonium-210 secretly slipped into his tea. His murder left a radioactive trail across the city and sparked a massive, years-long diplomatic crisis between the UK and Russia. So you can see how our modern rules for consumer safety and our responses to nuclear terrorism were also born from tragedy. So when you look at all of this, remote-controlled experiments, fail-safe engineering, consumer protection laws, even international regulations, you see the pattern, right? Our safety rulebook is a hard-won legacy, built on the absolute worst days of other people's lives. It's a sobering thought that almost every line in that book is written in blood. And that really brings us to the big question for today. All these stories, the Demon Core, Tokaimura, the K-19, they feel like they're from a different era, but are they? Progress never stops. What new dragons are we tickling right now? What unseen dangers are we facing? And what terrible price will be paid to write the safety rules of tomorrow?